Most of the developed nations have single-payer health care. So what that means is public health insurance, right? Now some go beyond that, the UK does, et cetera, but we don't. Why did we diverge from everyone else? How did that happen?
It really began in the 1880s, 1890s when medicine became a thing. And there was this guy named Frederick Ludwig Hartmann who came over here from Germany. And he was a young man, he was 17 in fact when he came over, and was a numbers genius. And he hooked up with the Prudential Life Insurance Company, ended up being a vice president. And he was the guy who figured out that there was an association, a statistical association between working in a cotton mill and having lung problems, asbestos and mesothelioma, smoking and lung cancer. He published on that in the 1910s, in the 1890s and 1910s. And diet and cancer. In fact, his book on the association between a high processed food diet and cancer is still in print. He's been dead since 1946, but his book is still around. So he's really smart in these things. And so he married this Southern belle from Georgia who was from a racist plantation family. And so he ran the numbers on black people and found that black people were dying, dropping like flies, more likely to be sick, more likely to die of pretty much everything. And concluded, which was the general consensus at the time among a lot of white people in the South, this is again in the 1890s, that black people were genetically inferior. And in 1896, he published a book called Race, Tendencies, and Traits of the American Negro, in which he lays out all the numbers, and then he concludes that if we simply avoided allowing black people to have any access to health care, that within 2 or 3 generations, the whole race would die out, and that would solve the race problem in America. Now, it sounds kind of crazy when I just lay it out like that right now, but this led to a whole bunch of things. By the 1920s, this was referred to as scientific racism. He was testifying about it before Congress. When Teddy Roosevelt, 1912, proposed a national healthcare system, people said no because black people will get it. When Franklin Roosevelt proposed a national healthcare system, it was the same thing. We don't want black people to get it. When Truman tried it in 47, same thing. Don't want black people to get it. Right up until 1965, Senator Stennis, the Dixiecrats in the South, was quoting Hoffman, who was by then dead, but is still very famous in this field, as saying this, we have to figure out a way to keep black people from using Medicare. This is when they were passing Medicare. And the way that they came up with was to have a 20% hole, a gap in Medicare, so that you had to pay 20% of your doctor's bill and your hospital bill. And that would discourage poor black people from showing up at the hospitals. I mean, it was the most shocking thing I discovered, Cenk, when I was doing the research on this book, is that nearly 100% of the reason why the United States is the only country in the world that doesn't define healthcare as a right and doesn't have any sort of national healthcare system to speak of is because of racism.
That's amazing. I love when you find hidden histories.
And that's why you've got 12 states that still haven't expanded Medicaid, right? Free health insurance for low income people, all former slave states.
Yeah, and so I remember when we talked about how Supreme Court clerk said that corporations were people, and how
John Chandler Davis in 1886.
Right, and how that started this whole corporations are people nonsense. It was never a Supreme Court decision, et cetera. Now this, but Thom, a lot of it seems to go back to race, and the more you look into American history, the more you realize it's not just original sin, that it's like a sickness that's still spreads and spreads and is still infecting us. So I remember when we were talking about guns, and the Second Amendment was because to support slave patrols. So
exactly.
And then talk to me about this interesting combination of capitalism and racism that we have in America that's produced what appears to be a toxic stew of not caring about one another. That it almost seems to have gone over from race to class. Like, hey, while we were not caring about black people and hoping that they would die quicker, we accidentally started doing that for poor people and then middle class people, and now the whole country is this kind of macabre, runaway, insane capitalism run amok, where we grind each other endlessly to the nub under corporate rule.
Yeah, a lot of what you're talking about falls under the larger rubric of neoliberalism, which, by the way, a year from now will be my next book, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism. And and that's the theory that markets are always smarter than bureaucrats, that capitalism is more important than democracy, that democracy in fact is outmoded and really needs to be, we'll give it lip service and everything, but what's really important is that the really smart people run everything, and the really smart people we know, of course, are the really rich people. It's like an economic version of Calvinism, the Calvinist theory that people like Betsy DeVos subscribe to, that all people are sinners. So how do we know who to pick to lead us? Well, God tells us by making some people rich, and those are the people who are God's chosen few. Well, you just tweak that slightly, and you've got Hayek and Mises and Friedman, their neoliberal theory that the people who are the chosen ones are the ones who are rich because the market chose them, because they're their own intelligence. And this brutality of the marketplace is destroying us. And this, we had a period in the United States from the 30s to the 80s, and you and I have talked about this before. I'm not sure if it was on the air or if it was over a beer years ago, but we had this period between the 30s and the 80s where we actually had capitalism to a significant extent kind of regulated and in a box, or at least the capitalists. And then Reagan came in and just introduced all these neoliberal reforms, radically cutting the top taxes that were maintaining, some level of equality, and inequality just exploded, and deregulating, industry after industry, leading to monopolies. And and when you throw race into that mix, then you get things like redlining, this whole toxic stew that we're seeing, that inappropriate policing, George Floyd being murdered. I mean, it's really all one giant kind of ball of string that it's really hard to pull pieces out and think that and find they're not discrete. They're all interconnected.